All right, I'm going to try to park myself over here and not wander around too much. So hopefully this sounds okay from here. So today we're going to talk about just Shelter Medicine 101, and what I want to do is introduce you to a couple of things. How many of you guys have seen the sheltermedicine.com website? Oh, that's fun. So go check out sheltermedicine.com. That's the UC Davis website, and there's tons and tons of information about shelter medicine on there. If you're thinking about doing a project, it's a great place to just peruse sort of through the information sheets and see what we have there for information sheets, and just kind of look around, and that hopefully will give you some ideas. We also have a Facebook page, and we spend a lot of time on there being kind of silly and showing you pictures of our foster pets. But we also spend a lot of time on there putting up interesting research articles or articles from the news or other things relating to shelter medicine that we think would be of interest. So you can get both if you go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/sheltermedicine. So this is a real email from a real shelter veterinarian, and what I'm hoping to do with the lecture today is kind of give you a feel for what shelter medicine feels like. And I know some of you have already had a taste of that, but so here we go. We had a litter of 7 puppies who seemed to have kennel cough. 2 of the 7 puppies got pretty sick and depressed, as I know kennel cough will do to some. So our clinic sent out blood samples to the lab, and it came back fairly positive for distemper. The pups were 9 weeks old at the test and had been given their first shots at 6 weeks of age, 3 weeks earlier. Is that important? Maybe. They came in perfectly fine at 5 weeks of age. I took the other 5 puppies to my home because she was shelter veterinarian. 8 days ago, the test came back last Friday. We euthanized the 2 that were in the clinic. However, they were much better that day. While the 5 pups I have at home are now almost completely well from the kennel cough, are happy, playful, eating well puppies. Is this just a phase of distemper? Not seen any neurologic signs of distemper in these pups at all. We did have them on cephalexin for 10 days, and that ended 3 days ago. Should I just euthanize these 5 pups now and be done with it, or wait it out since they seem to be healthy, about 90% better? So why is she even thinking about doing that? Louder. Disease transmission. So she's worried that even though they're better, they might still be infectious, right? Okay. And that's a pretty, again, I'm not going to answer all these questions. I'm trying to sort of set the stage for you. It's a really hard position to be in sometimes to say, wow, they're all better now, but are they safe? So she's trying to figure that question out. Really tough, but also really important, right? Because she's got to think about those 5 puppies, but she's got to think about the whole rest of her population too. We also have 3 adult dogs in the main kennels being treated for kennel cough. Their test also came back as low positive for distemper. Could these tests all be false positives, or should we be better safe than sorry and euthanize all? We are obviously a low-kill shelter. We only euthanize for pain and suffering. So this is just, again, I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but this is a common kind of scenario that we end up getting questions about, and we end up having to be in the midst of making these kinds of decisions over really understanding the diagnostic tests, sometimes usually interpreting those diagnostic tests in light of the entire picture. So just like for an individual animal, we want to look at the diagnostic test results that we get back and understand them in the context of everything we see about that animal. Right, the MRI might say go straight to surgery, but then you look at the dog and the dog's bouncing around. You're not going to go straight to surgery. So these are just to kind of set the stage in terms of what are the kind of conundrums that we can end up in. I wanted to give you an overview, just kind of what animal shelters there are, and I thought I would start with just a few pictures. This is a picture of an animal control officer. This is a picture of the new Wisconsin Humane Society shelter. That's the outside. This is the inside in Ozaki, Wisconsin. It's really a beautiful building and very environmentally friendly. Here's kind of the other side of the coin, which is not so giant and fancy, right? A much more low-resourced organization. Here's one of my foster kittens, just to be kind of representing that when we talk about shelter medicine and we talk about being a shelter vet and we talk even about shelters, we usually are including foster animals as well. And here's my picture from the Netherlands. This is their picture of other available dogs. That's better hungry. So I wanted to take you back a little bit into the history of animal sheltering and the way that animal sheltering began. This is a picture of Henry Bergh, was really in the mid to late 1800s. And many people think of Henry Bergh as being the father of the humane movement. That's very true in the United States, but actually Henry Bergh had been to England and had seen the ASPCA in England. And so when he came back, he was very interested in sort of founding something fairly similar. And when it started, the real interest that he had was very much an animal welfare interest, and it was very much directed towards working animals, especially horses, who he was seeing on a frequent basis being beaten in the streets. And he wanted to find a way to intervene. In those early years, and continuing, there was a very close connection between an understanding of child welfare and animal welfare. And as welfare organizations came up, there was often this connection between animal welfare and child welfare. We moved, then there was alignment of dog control with the humane movement was not something Henry Bergh really closely endorsed. And we can see probably why that was true. This is a picture from 1877 from the New York City dog pound, where at the time the means of animal control was going out, collecting all the dogs and drowning them in the river. And so Henry Bergh didn't want to be aligned with that. It was after Henry Bergh's death, it was about 100 years later, where the ASPCA then actually merged with animal control and tried to take on that task of being a welfare agency and an animal control agency, running both at the same time. And then about 100 years later, those two organizations separated their mission, and now the ASPCA is much more of just an animal welfare organization, though the ASPCA gives an enormous amount of support as well to New York City Animal Care and Control, and they have a close partnership. But just to give you sort of a sense of where things came from. So who takes care of homeless animals in the United States? There's no umbrella organization. And I wanted to ask, did most of you know that? So when you hear the word or the phrase SPCA, do you think those are all related? Great. Lots of people do. So when the ASPCA has a shelter in New York City, but otherwise the ASPCA is a national organization that works towards animal welfare and fighting animal cruelty and does lots of other things as well. Humane Society of the United States is another national organization. So there's lots of those national organizations, but there is no one umbrella organization. That's not as true in many other countries. There's more of an umbrella organization, but even in those countries like Australia, where the ASPCA functions, there's also other smaller shelters that don't fall underneath that umbrella. In Canada, for instance, there's the Ontario SPCA that is an umbrella for many shelters all around that province. And there's the British Columbia SPCA as well. In the United States, there's larger sort of conglomerated organizations, things like the Michigan Humane Society has many shelters all over Michigan, just as an example, or the Animal Humane Society in Minnesota is an organization that was founded by 5 shelters merging together to form one organization. So it's important to kind of just understand where that comes from. So there's public or government shelters, there's private, nonprofit shelters, there's rescue groups and foster networks, and often, most of the time, those are private or home-based. And so that sort of introduced a whole new way of thinking about things when all of a sudden, instead of having all the animals at a centralized location, now you have animals in these decentralized locations, and they're sort of intermingled in the public. So from a public health perspective, that's a really different challenge. It brings lots of benefits from an individual health standpoint, but obviously also has challenges as well. Then there's also, as I was mentioning, National Animal Shelter Advocacy Group, sorry, there's probably about somewhere over 9,000 groups. And that is hopefully helping to affect the 4 to 8 million animals a year going into shelters. In many states, there is little or no regulation whatsoever for animal shelters. In Wisconsin here, we very recently passed Act 90. Are you guys aware of Act 90? It's another, just from a perspective of thinking about projects, learning more about Act 90 or researching or making a presentation about Act 90 and the implications and the impacts of it, it would be an interesting thing to do. Act 90 was known as the puppy mill bill, but what was really interesting about Act 90 and one of the reasons it was passed is that the shelters all got behind it and said, even though we know this is going to be really hard for us to live up to too, we're going to back it because we think it'll shut down the puppy mills. And so the shelters have struggled, but are in general sort of living up to what was laid out for them in Act 90. But prior to Act 90, there really was very little regulation in Wisconsin for animal shelters. Come back and talk about that more. So again, this is a list. I hope I'm not leaving any out of the supporting national organizations. These are the ones that came to my mind as I was putting this together. These organizations all offer education to some extent, advocacy for animals and for animal shelters and for animal staff. So it's the American Society for Prevention to Cruelty to Animals, Maddie's Fund, HSUS is Humane Society of the United States, NACA is the National Animal Control Association, SAWA is the Society of Animal Welfare Administrators, PetSmart Charities, Best Friends in Utah, and then the National Federation of Humane Societies. What is a shelter is kind of the next question, and this is something that we talked a lot about when we did the Shelter Standards Project, which I'm going to lecture about pretty soon, is how do you define it now that it's become so dispersed and all over the place. So we said, well, it's municipal animal control, private humane society, it's a rescue group, foster home, could be even just a transport group. It could be a sanctuary. There's more and more of those. And it could even be a hospice. Many people talk about either hospice care or fospice care, which is like a foster situation where you send an animal for hospice care. And so all of those we want to kind of fall under our umbrella to be learning about and sort of creating and utilizing our basic knowledge. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about public or municipal shelters. How many of you guys have ever sort of volunteered or been part of working at a municipal shelter? Wow, so just a few. We need to get you guys out into more municipal shelters. So usually this is counties and cities, and they have to control stray animals and enforce laws. So that's usually their primary mission. And they're usually housed under the public health department or the sheriff, sanitation department, public works. Sometimes you find them housed under the strangest departments within city government or county government. And so, but sometimes, usually they're sort of historically, their purpose has been protection of public health. Over time, there has been a really dramatically increasing animal welfare and adoption focus for municipal shelters. And I included this picture, I hope you can see, of the Jacksonville Humane Society, Jacksonville Animal Care and Services, because it's a beautiful building. And there's lots of beautiful municipal facilities out there, and there's lots of, fantastic municipal facilities doing fantastic work and doing fantastic life saving. So I want to make sure that everybody doesn't think like, oh, every municipal facility is only going around and just enforcing laws. There's lots of great work not that enforcing laws isn't great work, but there's lots of great work being done by municipal shelters all over the country. This is an animal control officer. So what other shelter functions can be served? Stray animal rescue, capture and care, law enforcement, owner surrender, sometimes not. Sometimes they'll say, well, you know, owner surrender is really the owner's responsibility. And many times a more private agency will take on that role, and the animal control facility will just take the stray animals. We have a partner in UC Davis with the Yolo County Animal Services, and we work very closely with that municipal shelter at this point. So animal adoption, some yes, some no. It's pretty uncommon for them to not have any adoption program at all, but it is possible. In fact, the MADIC, which is the Milwaukee Area Domestic Animal Care and Control, doesn't have an adoption program. They're starting to do just a few adoption programs, but their primary means of live release is to transfer animals to other groups. The adoption component is mandated in California as well as some other places, but not everywhere. So some public shelters also have volunteer programs. They have low-cost spay-neuter programs, really, really vibrant live release programs, partnerships with private shelters. So there's lots of community initiatives going on. Maddie's has many community collaboratives. The ASPCA has their partnership programs. They have auxiliary support, or rescue groups that work with them. And many of the municipal shelters will have a friends group that is sort of the nonprofit support group that starts to support the animal control shelter. And that's true in Chicago, that's true in lots of places. So move on to private shelters, and here's your home shelter. This is Dane County Humane Society on the top, and the Indianapolis shelter just below. So most of these are non-profit groups, so 501(c)(3) that house domestic animals. They may be called an SPCA or a Humane Society, or they may be called something completely different. They can run a wide range from sanctuary to adoption agency to being really full service shelters. This is just a list of kind of what possible functions they might serve. So they might do animal sheltering. They might also have a contract with the municipality that they're in, and that's true of the Dane County Humane Society. So they have a contract both with the city of Madison and with the county, with Dane County, to take and hold their stray animals. They actually also just added contracts for many cities down in Rock County. So different shelters will expand their range in different ways and try to service what they can. So they do almost all of them. I don't know of any, in fact, that don't do adoption. Many do humane education, behavior and training, low-cost spay-neuter. Some do low-cost or sliding scale vet services. Some do wildlife rehab. And some even do animal cruelty investigation. This was a change in Dane County in the last 10 years, where it used to be that the humane officers for the county and the city were housed at the Humane Society, but they changed that, and now that's no longer part of the Humane Society. That's just a part of the county-county government. Rescue groups are really an important part of that. This is a rescue group that's actually made up of UC Davis students. And UC Davis students have a really wide array of stuff they're doing with shelters. They have a foster pet project, foster kitten project. I think they call it the orphan kitten project. Yep. And so they take the kittens in and they do orphan fostering, and then they adopt them all out. There's another program at UC Davis where they can, it's a surgery program where students get to learn with a surgical mentor by doing more advanced surgeries that shelter animals need, and then those animals get adopted. So it's a great service for shelters that wouldn't have that resource otherwise. So rescue groups can be species focused, breed focused, age, disease, or condition focused. Some of them don't have a focus in that way. They just do what they want to do. They just pull animals that move them one way or another, try to get them into homes. They can be just a single home. They can be a network of homes. These are veterinary clients in private practice in many cases. So even if you're not going to go be a shelter veterinarian and you're just going to be a veterinarian in private practice, you will almost certainly see rescue groups in your private practice. And so it's really important for private practitioners too to sort of have an understanding of how shelter medicine works and what the important priorities are and ways of thinking about things to be able to help the rescue groups. Sanctuaries are also really a reality. This one is called the Ledoux Foundation, and they pull animals and they all live in this big house together. And they do occasionally do adoptions, but it's not really their intention. So the intention is for these animals to get to live in this house and hang out and watch TV together and just kind of live out their lives. And if they get adopted, that's great. But what that means, obviously, is that they have to be very careful to provide a great quality of life for these animals while they're living with them, and also careful to select only the number of animals that can comfortably fit in their homes. So sometimes in animal shelters, we can see that there can be this overlap between the idea of sanctuary and the idea of a shelter with the intention of adopting, where sometimes a shelter with the intention of adopting turns more into a sanctuary. But if we don't have all the resources that we need to give those animals a long-term right quality of life, then we need to be really careful. So that's something to think about when you think about sanctuaries. But there are some fantastic sanctuaries out there, and there's lots of sanctuaries that are primarily set up as sanctuaries, but also do lots of adoptions as well. Lots of public-private partnerships out there, private shelter contracts with the cities to provide stray animal housing. There's private auxiliary groups that can work with the public shelter to fundraise. So that's one of the big important things to understand is many of the public animal control organizations, they're a government agency, so they can't fundraise. And so that's where those friends groups come in off the time. That's a nonprofit support group. They can raise money and then they can use that money to support that organization. And so we see lots of partnerships between veterinary clinics and veterinary schools and shelters that are beneficial to the students and the animals and the whole organization for both agencies. So Dr. Hurley actually put this chart together quite a while ago, and I decided to include it because I think it's really important for you guys to get a sense of how this, to me, really speaks to the intense variation in what there is out there in terms of shelters and how different things might seem to you as an animal who turns up in one shelter compared to an animal who turns up in another shelter. So if we look at the top, there's a shelter with an intake of about 7,000, live release of a little less than 2,000, and an annual budget of 525,000. The amount of money in their annual budget per animal is about $76 per animal. And if we look down at the bottom, we see there's a shelter with about 3,500 intake. Almost all of the animals are being released alive. And look at that annual budget. So that's a whopping annual budget, and if we break that down to a cost per animal, obviously probably not every penny of this budget is being spent on actual medical care, so we need to understand that when we look at the organizations. But just to see how that is, it's important to see that it's not always that life, well, it doesn't show that so much in this chart. It's important to understand, at least, that more money doesn't always mean more lives saved, but it certainly does help. So in any case, just important to really understand that there's a vast variety of challenge. And so the way I always think about this is when I look at a shelter, first question is kind of, well, what's their challenge? And that's kind of that first line. What's their intake? And we often, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about population management, we often think of that as intake per capita or intake per 1,000 people when we want to make comparisons between communities. So Dane County right now is a very successful community. If we look at it, part of that is because the intake per capita is very low. The same is true in many other very successful communities that we see. So many people think, oh, you know, we could just adopt our way out of this. We just need more adoptions and more adoptions. But the truth is, what we often see is that in the really successful communities, it's because the challenge is getting diminished. And so it's easier to meet the challenge when you're a little less challenged, right? So just to sort of think about that. And then we can look at live release per capita too, and you can compare, obviously, you know, there are many cities where live release per capita isn't particularly high, or adoption per capita. And that's true probably of San Francisco. That I haven't looked at that recently for Dane County, but it's probably relatively true for Dane County as well. But it's okay because it's enough. It's enough to meet the challenge. And in fact, in places like Dane County or in places like San Francisco, there's probably more adoptions than challenge. So many organizations in Dane County are transporting animals in and finding within a certain category that there's a little more room. There's a little more room in our sponge, right, to soak up those animals. So it's important to understand that. Notes on terminology. We'll hear lots of people using lots of terminology, and when you start reading in the media especially, you'll see lots of these terms flying about. So high turnover or low turnover, what does that mean? Great, how long animals stay. And usually, so a high turnover means they don't stay too long. My impression usually when somebody's staying on high turnover shelter too, I tend to think of it as a fair number of animals coming in and not staying a really long time. But that's, you're more correct probably if we're really using the term right. So we really want most shelters to be fairly high turnover. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. But not everyone is going to be able to. It's not always appropriate. Full service. Anybody have an idea what that means? What do you think? Great, so they have their own vet on staff. Probably they can do everything from intake to treatments to adoption. That's probably what I would think it would mean. Does anybody have, there are other pieces I might include. Anybody have any other ideas of what you might include? Yeah. Great, so intake, surrenders, surrender, scheduled, unscheduled, stray. Anything else? Animal, maybe an animal control component. So what I'm showing you is you have to, a lot of the time you have to ask somebody, what do you mean by full service? Because it could mean lots of different things. So you want to be careful what people mean. Open admission or limited admission. What does open admission mean? Anything that walks in the door can stay. Okay. Do you think it always means that? What are the other sort of permutations it might mean? They don't turn anybody away. So they don't turn anybody away, but sometimes a shelter, I've definitely worked with shelters who call themselves open admission, but they schedule their surrenders. So they won't tell you you can't come, but they might tell you you can't come this minute. So that's usually what that means. What is limited admission? We decide whether you can come or not. Okay. Adoption guarantee. Any ideas on that one? Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's not what it usually is meant to be. But so what she said was if it doesn't work out, you can return the animal. Almost every shelter has that as part of their adoption contract, but that's great. Okay. Great, so she's saying if the animal comes in the door, it's sort of guaranteed to walk back out the door as an adoption, and that's certainly the idea. What is often included in the idea of adoption guarantee is adoption guarantee for particular categories of animals. So usually what they mean is for an animal that's considered either healthy or treatable, and so they would only say that they wouldn't support they wouldn't guarantee adoption for an animal that they didn't consider to be in a treatable category. But again, these are all like little permutations that come in, but it's important just to sort of understand the concept. I put up on here no kill, or, you know, what's the opposite of that? Again, what do you guys think when you hear no kill? What do you think it means? So they wouldn't euthanize for space, okay? Do you think that's what most people think when they hear no kill? So sometimes they think there's absolutely no euthanasia. So it can mean a wide range of things, but it's an important phrase for many people, so you should be aware of it. And sometimes if you hear somebody using it, you may even want to kind of clarify what exactly they mean. For some people, it means that over 85% of the animals are saved. For some, it means 90% or more. For some, it means only animals who were considered untreatable or unmanageable were not saved. So that's there's lots of different ways of defining these terms. And there's increasing efforts at definition and making productive alliances. So trying to find language and ways to work together where the thing that I'm calling myself doesn't cast aspersions at somebody else who's doing other good work in other places. So there's definitely lots of really good work in our community to try to find ways of talking and recording things and reporting our data and all of those things to find places where we can all come together and agree on those things. And that is really exciting to be part of that and watching all of that. It's important to understand when you look at all of these things that none of them are necessarily mutually exclusive. You know, so you may have a shelter that falls into two different categories. As I said, they may be open admission, maybe they're open admission to strays, but limited admission to owner surrenders. So there's lots of different ways of looking at it. No two shelters are quite the same or totally different, no matter what terminology is used, and you'll find that. To me, that's kind of fascinating. You know, when I went to Australia and then I went to the Netherlands and I go to Canada and I see the shelters there and I keep thinking they're going to be so drastically different than what I've seen here. And there's lots of ways that things are different, but lots and lots of ways that things are the same. And I find there's more similarities than differences in shelters. We're all mostly trying to do the same thing. So I'm going to go through this a little quickly, but in the 70s and 80s, we got to a place where really we started professionalizing shelters. This is a picture of Phyllis Wright, and she was understood to be sort of one of the first people to come in and really start promoting professionalism in the field. This is when the birth of many important things in the field of sheltering came about. It had been considered sort of, if you were working in a shelter, it was probably, especially if you were a veterinarian, you would only work in a shelter kind of because you couldn't work somewhere else. And I think there was a lot of aspersion sort of cast at shelters. And during this time in the 70s and 80s, things started getting professionalized, and it was the first wave kind of real movement, and it's continued on as really an enormous wave, which has been incredibly exciting. And this slide is actually borrowed from Gary Petronik, and he tells a story about going to one of the very first HSUS Expo conferences, and Phyllis Wright was giving a lecture, and at one point in the lecture, she realized that Gary, who was a veterinarian, was sitting in the audience, and she stopped her lecture and said something about Gary being a veterinarian, and everyone looked at him and sort of gasped because they couldn't believe there was a veterinarian interested in their shelter conference. And that's obviously changed so much since that time. This is from the Maddie's Fund website, and this is, you know, this is exactly what we want to see, right? And this is to some extent, I think, you know, a result of the progress that's been made in terms of different understandings about what sheltering is. So this is the euthanasia per 1,000 people. Again, we need to remember that we still don't have really good data about this. So when I say to you 4 to 8 million animals, that's a huge range, right? We don't even know exactly how many shelters there are, much less exactly how many animals are going into them. We can all fairly well agree that this trend appears to be true and real, and that's really, really exciting, and we want it to continue because although it is really real and really exciting, it's not good enough yet, right? We need to keep going on that. There's always ongoing challenges. So this is a report from Los Angeles about a PM leukopenia outbreak. There's always going to be things like this going on because of the risks involved with bringing large number of animals with different risk factors together. Maybe not always. When there's not, then we can all retire. And then sometimes there's unexpected challenges. This is from Wisconsin. When I graduated from vet school, I was so worried about going out into the world never having seen distemper, because we don't see distemper in Wisconsin. And what we find is, yes, we do see distemper in Wisconsin, just not very often, but then what happens is nobody's thinking about it. So it sneaks up on us, and when it does, it's really awful. And so Wisconsin Humane last year had a distemper outbreak. They did an amazing job working through it with really, really minimal loss of life. It was phenomenal. They did a phenomenal job of interacting with the public about it. It was great to see. We also have more subtle challenges. So even though things are getting so much better, we still have problems like this. And this is a kitty. I want you guys to call out and tell me what you think's going on here. So why is this a challenge? So somebody tell me a problem. You gotta say it loud enough. He's in a pretty small cage. And he's what? And he's fancy. And he's antsy. He's fancy and antsy. So he's antsy because it's breakfast. He's just about to get his breakfast. But he's pacing back and forth. And what's he doing while he's antsy? Or trying to do? A little louder? He's rubbing his face. And that's okay. Trying to get attention. What's he doing with his body? Or trying to do with his body? Not going so well. He wants to get out for sure. Go on with his tail. I'm going to play it one more time. How important is it to a cat to be able to raise their tail? Minimally important? Somebody's shaking their head. Why? Not minimally important? Yeah, so it's a really important behavioral signal, right? It's, I'm really happy and I want you to give me breakfast, right? But he can't even do it in that cage. So one of the things that we look at is, well, how do we evaluate, instead of just saying, well, it's too small, why is it too small? So it's too small because he can't express his normal behavior. He can't stretch to his full body length. And so one of the things we do in shelter medicine is to try to answer those questions in ways that will help give concrete answers. Other challenges include, this is Thyme and Sage Ranch, which I think many of you probably know about. This is a case from Wisconsin where a shelter had taken on an animal control contract for a county and then just gotten really completely out of control. It was really just a woman's house. And she had 315 dogs in really poor condition. Okay, so now we're going to move into just a quick overview of how does shelter medicine fit into what are shelters. And this is just really pictures of us all over the place. Given sort of the premise that I set up for you guys, what why should we be involved? Well, if we think about the veterinary oath, shelter medicine has it all, except for the livestock piece. So protection of animal health, relief of animal suffering, promotion of public health, advancement of medical knowledge. These are all really important pieces and really important pieces to consider. Animal homelessness creates financial and emotional costs for everyone. Can create a huge public health risk. This is actually a picture of this little kid kissing this kitten in a shelter that had an ongoing salmonella outbreak, and there were signs everywhere saying not to handle the cats without supervision, potential for animal suffering and death on a really massive scale when we start to think about the way the numbers fall out here. So I know I told you the scope of the problem. This is something Dr. Hurley worked out. So if we look at 4 to 8 million animals per year, 2 to 5 million deaths, this is actually old, I should say. The way she figured this out, it was about 20,000 deaths within a 30-minute drive of UC Davis. So about the same as the small animal caseload at the university. And I remember doing the exact same calculation actually for UW, and it works out about the same. When we think about why should we be involved as veterinarians, there is no other disease that we could look at that has even anywhere near the impact that this does. There's nothing that has anywhere near the morbidity and mortality caused by animal homelessness. So I feel like I'm like a public service announcement for why veterinarians should be involved in shelter medicine. And I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, I think. But it's really important to understand. This is really important. The impact on survivors of coming through animal shelters may be none, and we hope that's true. Nothing other than finding a great home and going on your way, and that's what we really, really hope for. But it can be acute or chronic illness. It can be behavioral issues, and it can be problems for community health. How do veterinarians work with animal shelters? Lots of different ways. So they can be board members, advisors to the shelter, just giving as needed service, either outpatients or actually, so they come to your clinic, or some shelters have a veterinarian who comes once a week or twice a week. Some shelters have veterinarians just who do surgery for them, part-time, full-time, can be consultants, you can be in a leadership role as a shelter director or a shelter operations director. The veterinarian in a couple of shelters that we work with is actually also the director of operations. And then you can also go into academic shelter medicine, which is fun and easy. So this is Dr. Hurley. We were in Las Vegas, which was one of the most horrifying shelter consultations we had ever done. It was a really challenging shelter. It's all much better now, which makes us happy. I'll show you some pictures of it. But when we were there, we walked into the county building, and when we were in the county building, we found this giant hammer in the county building, and Dr. Hurley was so pleased. She was like, "This is what we need." And so what we want to do is we want to have tools that allow us to have that really giant hammer and not have the really giant hammer hit us back. And that is sometimes what it feels like in shelter medicine. But boy, having a really big hammer in your hand and using it well is a really gratifying experience. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the Shelter Standards Project very soon, so I'm not going to go into it for too long. But it's again, had a huge impact, I think, on shelter medicine. So we can think about kind of all these inputs and outputs going into shelter medicine. We think about education. These are all the things that, I think about most of these things almost every day as I'm working. So education, behavior evaluation, population planning, all of these things feed into a shelter. And what that helps us do is decrease intake of healthy animals, increase adoptions, increase welfare, and happy public. Sure, we do a lot of individual animal treatment, and that's a really important part of shelter medicine. And so I want to make sure that people recognize that that's true. This is one of my foster babies, probably attacked by a dog at some point. But individual treatment of a kitten like this really does. It inspires public support, it improves staff commitment. It feels just great. It really does. It saves more lives. It facilitates compliance with the rules. So one actual study that we found when we instituted treatment for ringworm at Dane County Humane Society is it dramatically improved compliance with people reporting ringworm. If the outcome was that the animals were going to be euthanized once they were discovered to have ringworm, it's like people's eyes just don't see it. Now that they know the animals are going to get treated, I see two nodding ex-technicians. The volunteers are happily coming up to you in the hallway, showing you every lesion because they know that it's going to be a good outcome and the animals are going to go to a treatment area where they get probably more care than even the cats in the shelter. So it really does change things, but obviously also has to be balanced with population health. Sometimes you get great, cheap thrills from individual animal treatment. This is a dog that had tick paralysis before and after. How great is that? There's nothing almost as fun as that. Here's a picture of a kitty named Buster, and I wanted to just read you a letter that I got from Buster's mom. It says, hi, I was going through, so let me just tell you a little bit about Buster actually. So Buster had been hit by a truck when he came to the shelter, and he was blind, and he seemed like he might be feral because anytime anybody tried to get near him, he would kind of go crazy. But we thought it might be because he was suddenly blind, and that was probably really freaking him out. And so we actually put him in a foster home with one of the technicians and let him sort of come around because we thought we'd be able to just, if we gave him some time, things might improve, and it turned out they did. And so she wrote this letter. I was going through my things recently and came across a card you sent me years ago after I adopted my cat from the Humane Society. I don't know if this email is still good, but on the off chance it is, I wanted to let you know that every once in a while when I'm struck anew by what an amazing animal has come to live with me, I think of you and what you did for him. And send up a note of thanks to the ruler of all life for you and people like you. That's the important thing I wanted to say this morning. Less important, I guess, is how your nursling is getting along in the world. He's just incredible. And she talks all about how he likes to travel with her, and she takes him on the plane, and he loves going on the plane. And then she says, I call him my ambassador of goodwill for the feline kingdom because he also persuades people to go out and adopt cats. I tell people about how he had a hard time of it living on his own and came to the shelter, and how you took him in and cared for him, and the next thing I know, people have new cats at home. He's sort of personally responsible for at least 5 adoptions that I know of. Anyway, the reason I'm showing you that is that individual animal treatment is incredibly important, and it's got a great payoff. This is a news article from the Massachusetts ASPCA. This is the big payoff, right? They had a dog who needed heart surgery because she had a PDA, and they did really incredibly effective media coverage of this little puppy. They actually had a girl with the same heart condition go on TV with the puppy. And they raised $50,000 to help other animals like Daisy through that project. Shelter health management is another huge part of what we do and what shelter medicine is about, by maintaining animal health and welfare, using resources efficiently, reducing intake, finding homes, doing all of these great things, because this is what leads to the big payoff. And this is a shelter. This is the Las Vegas shelter, and these are the after pictures of the Las Vegas shelter. This shelter served about 60,000 animals a year. And so if you think about that great feeling that you get from that individual animal treatment, which is a phenomenal feeling, and multiply that by 60,000 animals a year, if you can use good shelter health practices to set things right in a shelter like this. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing that feels as good as doing that. And so that is, I think, really, the really big payoff. This is another really big payoff, which is that because we've now got this incredible support group of shelter veterinarians out there, we can help other veterinarians work through what isn't always an easy process. And so this is a note, again, from this veterinarian. I'm in the process of implementing strict disease control protocol that I believe in 100%. In the process, I am upsetting staff and volunteers, and I have to please the media. I'm very well supported by my director and some of the managers, but my daily decisions of life and death are upsetting so many lay and non-lay people. What can I do to help this situation? I hate to make people upset, but I'm trying very hard to stick to my guns and beliefs, and I'm starting to have poor sleeping habits due to the stress of upsetting people and making the tough decisions. And so this is something where we can all work together to support each other. There's a really hugely increasing demand for shelter veterinarians out there in all sorts of places, with pay that's commensurate to veterinary practice, with benefits and regular hours. So don't think of shelter medicine as a place that you have to sort of give up everything that you hoped about personally in order to make it happen for yourself. And this link here is for the Association of Shelter Veterinarians webpage, where they list job openings and opportunities. Lots of people use that. More opportunities in shelter medicine. These are shelter medicine specialists from all over the country. You know, there's private, you can work with shelters while you're in private practice, mixed private and shelter, consultation, national outreach, veterinarians working as academics. There's lots of internships in shelter medicine. In fact, we're going to have our very own intern next year. Our UC Davis intern is going to be at in Wisconsin at the Dane County Humane Society, sitting in the back of the room. And there's residency programs, master's programs, PhDs, clinical instruction, academic research, mobile services. Just wanted to make you aware, the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, you guys have a club membership to that here. There's over 750 members. There's student chapters at many of the vet schools. We offer continuing education at major conferences, and the board specialty is in progress and will be a subspecialty of the ABVP, and that's coming very, very soon in 2014. So in summary, shelter medicine is individual animal treatment, population medicine, which includes everything that kind of falls underneath that, vet student training, shelter staff training, continuing ed, specialist training, development of a body of knowledge. Oops, that was in there twice. And the bottom line is that by using all the knowledge that we have developed in shelter medicine and with watching shelter medicine expand as dramatically as it has in the last couple of years, we can save individual animals with a relatively small investment. We can help even more by identifying and managing outbreaks. We can help still more by preventing disease and conserving resources. And I think probably even more importantly, we can empower people and entire communities to take better care of animals now and in the future. And then we all get to retire because there won't be any problem anymore. So thanks to everybody here and online for your interest. Thanks to Maddie's Fund and the ASPCA for supporting this course for so many years now, and special thanks to the ASPCA for the partnership with UC Davis that makes my position possible. And there are some resources here at the end for people to see if you just want to learn a little more about national organizations. So thanks, everybody. And if anybody has questions or anything about the course that you want to run by me.
If you are registered for the course and you have not signed this piece of paper written your name down, please do so. It needs to be filled out.
I was just about to say, and it's really, really important if you eat to put your name on the food list, because if you don't, then you may not end up not getting food again, because they have to turn that in to show who ate the food. And it's a really important piece of doing it. And thanks to the club for taking over and getting the food, because I used to do that and it was tons of work, so thank you very much.